Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Story River Zen Center on this 11th day of April. So, last week I presented the great matter of birth and death. And I mentioned that in Zen temples, the instrument called the Han, a wooden board struck with a wooden mallet. Inscribed on it are words, and see how well I can remember them, like wake up or awaken. Life is transient, life is fleeting. Great is great is the matter of birth and death. Don't waste time. Don't waste your life. Various ways of translating that. And that's the Han is the instrument that calls the Zen practitioners to the Zendo. And the sound is meant to evoke that kind of urgency is not the right word, but seriousness of import, seriousness of intent, that the matter of birth and death is important. This evening, I hope to connect the great matter of birth and death to the, shall we say, tentatively anyway, the resolution of the problematic. Buddha nature is the answer to the quest. But before I do that, I feel really compelled to share with you about a woman that I encountered just yesterday. This woman who I encountered just yesterday, I must say, has rocked my world. You might even say that I've quickly become obsessed with her. Her name is Etty Hillison. Etty Hillison. Let me tell you a little bit about Etty. And I think there's something about her that can help us begin to understand from a different lens, a different perspective, what Buddha nature can mean, what it is. So Etty Hillison, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was born on January 15th, 1914 in Middelburg, Holland. All we know of her are from her diaries and her letters. A complete English translation of these documents, which I don't have, at least not yet, spans 800 pages, and that's all we have. And she was almost completely unknown until the early 1980s, because I encountered her yesterday in my studies, and I was surprised. I had, in what I found out when I began to explore a little bit, profoundly impacted me. And I was so profoundly impacted that I felt a little chagrined that why had I not, heard of her before? Well, nobody had heard of her until, very few people had heard of her until her diaries and letters were published. I think 1986 was when the unabridged edition came out. And then, other people were impacted by her, and now she's getting more and more well known. Anyway, as I said, she was born in Middelburg, Holland in January 15th, 1914. Her first diary entry was in 1941, March 9th, Amsterdam, age 27. And she died pardon me, 19, I can't read my own writing. Age 27, yeah, age 27, 1941. She died in 1943 in Auschwitz. So these diary entries in these letters spans about 2.5 years. And during those 2.5 years, she underwent a radical transformation. In fact, the book that I'm referencing tonight is entitled Eddie Hillison, A Life Transformed. Her first published letters and journal autobiography, her diary entries, was entitled A Life Interrupted. And this later author who's writing about her spun that into A Life Transformed. So the diaries and letters spanned 2.5 years, and she came from a very chaotic home. Both her two brothers had severe mental illnesses and were hospitalized at various points in their lives. She herself suffered from bouts of severe depression, and which she said she blamed her chaotic home environment for the condition of her siblings and herself. And so her very few first entries are describing her dilemma, her anguish over her own chaotic state of being. Then she encountered a man who was a former colleague of Gustav Jung. So he was an analyst, a Jungian schooled psychoanalyst. And she entered into a relationship with him and went engaged in psychoanalysis with him. And in that process, she found some core strength. And this core strength eventuated into a profoundly deep contemplative awareness. She came out of a secular Jewish home. Her father's grandfather was a prominent rabbi, but by the time the bloodline got down to him, they weren't practicing Judaism anymore. They were secular Jews. So, and she was raised with no religious background. And she never became a member of a synagogue or a church. She was, as far as spiritual training goes, aside from the Jungian analysis, she was a pure autodidact. You know, she taught herself, she explored herself. She read the New Testament, especially the Gospel of Matthew. In her luggage at one point, I don't know if it's when she went to Auschwitz or when she was in the transitional camp in the Netherlands, they found in her luggage, what was in her luggage, I'm just beginning to study her life, so I'm just a little sketchy on the details, was a copy of the Quran and the Zohar, I think, you know, so she was drawing from a number of sources. She was really profoundly influenced by yoga. So anyway, that's a little bit about her life, okay? And I encountered her, I was reading David Lloyd's book, Lack and Transcendence, which I'll probably be talking about a little bit later. But he's talking about, in the section where he's talking about the denial of death and looking at it from various perspectives, psychoanalytic, philosophical perspectives, he quotes her. And since I went ahead and purchased the book on Kindle today, I have a more complete version of the quote. And so here it comes. The passage from which Lloyd extracted his quote is as follows. By coming to terms with life, I mean, the reality of death has become a definite part of my life. My life, so to speak, has been extended by death. by my looking death in the eye and accepting it, by accepting destruction as a part of life and no longer wasting my energies on fear of death or refusal to acknowledge its inevitability. It sounds paradoxical. By excluding death from our life, we cannot, and this last part is what Loy quotes. It sounds paradoxical. By excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life. And by admitting death into our life, we enlarge and enrich it. So that was the quote that David Loy was using. He was talking about, the repression of death, that a lot of conscious energy, when we're in denial of death, and our culture is vastly in denial of death, medicine and other things, when we repress, conscious knowledge of the reality of death, it takes a lot of psychic energy to keep that down. And what Freud discovered is that repressed contents have this urge to bubble back up into consciousness in symbolic form. And so there's this, I don't know if it's a tug of war or a hide and seek. I don't know what the right analogy would be, but tug of war sounds pretty good. You're tugging away from the truth of death, and the truth of death is tugging back and creates this perpetual restlessness. And Loy's bringing a lot of text sources, a lot of thought about unpacking that. The thesis of his book is that the repression of death, knowledge of the reality of death, is a secondary phenomenon. The fundamental repression is the repression of the fact of impermanence of the self right now, the illusion of the self right now, that the ego self has some deep intuition that it suppresses about its unreality, and it tries to compensate by making itself real through immortality projects, a term that Loy adopts from, I think, Norman O'Brown, if I remember correctly. And these immortality projects, fame, wealth, power, but since that's fame, wealth, and power are reinforcing the sense of the ego's reality, but it's not real, there's always a sense of lack, which manifests as, not that the ego is unreal, the self is unreal, but it manifests as, I'm not famous enough, I'm not successful enough, I'm not rich enough, I'm not powerful enough, the hungry ghost phenomenon. Like, if only I could get more, then I could rest, then I'd be real enough, and that never works. So that's that's basically what that book is trying to look at, the phenomenon. That book, meaning David Loy's book, Lack and Transcendence, is trying to look at the phenomena of dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, in a contemporary light, using lenses of philosophy, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, anthropology, various things. And it's fascinating work. I'm enjoying it a lot. But more about Eddie. I want to share with you something that she says about the camp she was in. This is before Auschwitz. This was a transitional camp in a small town near Amsterdam. I think near Amsterdam, but in Holland. And they had railroad tracks pointing straight to Auschwitz. So people would come here in transition, and I think a total of 100,000 people went from that camp. The name of Westerbork camp. 100,000 eventually ended up in Auschwitz. And of course, Eddie also eventually ended up in Auschwitz. But here's this section here. Her letters vividly describe the conditions of the camp at Westerbrook. Desperately overcrowded wooden barracks, labyrinths of barbed wire, watchtowers, mud, and misery. In a patch of heath, half a kilometer square. It was a community living in dread of the weekly transport, which left each Tuesday with its freight wagons crammed full of men, women, children, and infants bound for the east. In this hell, she spent the last 3 months of her life, caring for the vulnerable, visiting the sick in the hospital barracks, and writing letters to friends. By the person she was, by her vitality and warmth, her humanity and compassionate care, she became a source of life and inspiration to others. It was from this place that, despite everything that was happening around her, she wrote, "Life is glorious and magnificent." So that's a little bit about Eddie. Like I say, I think she had a profound awakening in her life, and more about that later. But I'm really captivated and enthralled by this person who I just learned about yesterday. I'll reference her again, but first I want to talk about Buddha nature, lay some foundational concepts to begin to speak about Buddha nature, understand in the history of Buddha Dharma what the term might mean. I just want to find the proper place for my notes here. So the term Buddha nature, the earliest term is Tathagata, from early Indian Mahayana sources, such as the famous Uttara Shastra, which is considered, sometimes it's called the Buddha nature treatise, although that's not in the title that Sangha and Maitreya came up with. That's sometimes how it's referred to in the Buddha nature treatise. It's Uttara Tantra. His Holiness the Dalai Lama translates sublime continuum. Uttara is like highest, like Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi is unexcelled enlightenment, unexcelled, complete, unsurpassed enlightenment. So Uttara is utmost, utmost. Tantra, the Dalai Lama translates as continuum. Etymologically, it means thread. And in the practice of Tantra, the thread is the thread of consciousness of practice that is cultivating, for instance, deity yoga. So Tantra means continuum, mental continuum by implication. And so that's what the word means. But in that teaching, they present Tathagata Karma. Tathagata is another term for the Buddha, the historical Buddha. And all other Buddhists are also Tathagatas as well. The word Tathagata means one who thus comes, or it can also mean thus coming, thus going. Or so the implication is what's happening now. You know, I remember Flip Wilson had a comedy routine about the church of what's happening now. You know, I don't want to talk about the past, what the future's going to be like. This is the church. You know, don't wait for heaven by and by when you die. Have yours now with ice cream on top. So that's a Tathagata means now. You know, Buddha now. You know, always coming, always going. The nature of the moment, arising and passing. You know, Tathagata. So that's an epitaph of the Buddha. Thus come, thus gone, always coming, always going. Now, Garbha is the interesting term. Well, they're all interesting, but Garbha means etymologically womb or embryo. It can mean both. So Tathagata Garbha means the womb or the embryo of the Tathagata. the womb or embryo of Buddha. The inherent Buddha nature that all beings possess. So the term has the word Buddha in it, but not the word nature. It has the word Dharma. When the teachings came to China, and I forget the Chinese, the term Buddha nature came into existence for the Tathagata. So the term Buddha nature in China, in Japan, means the same thing. Basically, it comes from the Tathagata tradition. There's a bit of a what would be the right word? A bit of a caveat or a bit of a potential pitfall with this image, and it was critiqued in the history of Buddha Dharma. There was, some controversy, what's the word I'm looking for? Some controversy with that about the term. Some Buddhists thought that it was reifying this notion of a nature like Atman in Hinduism, and which violates the notion of no self. And there's some legitimacy to that, but anything we say has potential pitfalls. And so even though Tathagata, if taken literally, like something inside of us that is waiting to come out, when we look at Dogen, we'll see that that's kind of a crude understanding compared to Dogen's understanding of Buddha nature. There is a problem with it, but it can also be a skillful means. One fascicle of Dogen's, I forget exactly how the title goes, but it's something like untangling entangled vines with entangled vines. So, you use concepts which themselves are problematic because they're concepts to deconstruct other concepts. And that's what happened historically with the Tathagata. Tathagata, that school of Buddhism evolved or came into being when Madhyamaka practitioners, the school that emphasizes shunya, emptiness, there seemed to be a problem with that concept leading to a nihilistic understanding of there's nothing matters. And that the Tathagata concept was introduced as an entangled vine to untangle the entanglement around emptiness, if you follow that. So yes, there is problems with reification with the Tathagata concept, but if you don't grasp it tightly and allow it to deconstruct what it's supposed to deconstruct and then let go of it, you're all right, if you can follow that. So Buddha nature. What is Buddha nature? Well, Joan Stambaugh, a philosopher who has written books on various topics, not just Buddhism or Eastern thought, did write a book about Dogen, which she entitled "Impermanence is Buddha Nature." So that's maybe like the via negativa. What Buddha nature is the lack of an abiding self. I'm having trouble getting that words out. So Buddha nature itself is simply the lack of an abiding self. Dogen says that if you examine myriad things with a confused body and mind, you might suppose that their nature is permanent. But when you practice intimately and return to where you are, to the arising of awareness right here, right now, it will become clear that nothing at all has unchanging self. So one way of looking at Buddha nature. Buddha nature is the inherent lack of the self-subsistent nature in anything. Another way of looking at Buddha nature is Buddha nature is equivalent to being time. You know, that Dogen presents that time, the arising of being perpetually, the actual nature of time outside of the linear concept of time, of the coming into being of being time. Now, always now, is Buddha nature. So basically the same thing, one expressed kind of negatively, that Buddha nature is no abiding self for anything. Buddha nature is what's always fresh and new, always changing, but always coming into being. Now this, now this, now this. So that's one way of looking at it. And that's a couple ways of looking at it. Buddha nature is, the earliest teaching was Buddha nature was the embryonic seed of Buddhahood, which is the actual nature of beings. But this seed is covered by obscurations. And so we cannot express it, we cannot see it as long as these obscurations cover it. And there's two categories of obscurations. Afflictive emotions, the turbulence of, hatred, jealousy, lust. When that turbulence is happening, we can't see the clear nature of being as it's arriving, independent of desire or aversion. And then cognitive obscurations, slapping concepts and labels and names on things. We don't see the thing anymore, we just see the name. So in the early teaching, that's Buddha nature. Buddha nature is that inherent capacity that we don't get from outside. It's already within awareness, but the surface disturbance, the surface confusion obscures the clarity of Buddha nature. And then in Dogen, which we'll look at, I think we'll have time maybe to look at Dogen's unpacking of Buddha nature. That Buddha nature is incessant change itself, impermanence itself. And Buddha nature is the way being time actually manifests each moment. Inseparable. That being is time, time is being. That's Buddha nature, and it's everywhere, inexhaustible. But before I go further on Buddha nature, I want to share with you the quote from Eddie Hillison that rocked my world. That really has had a big effect on me. Come on. And this is from chapter 2, Discovering God. So, and one reason why I talked about the pitfall of Tathagata Dharma that I've taken literally, it's a reification of a nature like Atman, which made some Buddhists skeptical of it. Likewise, the term God. God can be just a tangled vine with which you can untangle another tangled vine, which I think is true in Eddie's case. And reminder that when she uses the word God, it's not within, she was resistant to any organized religion. She had no interest in organized religion. And so, although she was moved by the words of Jesus in the Gospels, she didn't become a Christian. She didn't practice the Judaism of her ancestry. She found her own way, and she discovered her own inner contemplative life as an autodidact, as I said, all on her own. And so her use of the word God is quite particular to her path. And so please don't get stuck on that. I know as Buddhists, we're non-theists, but that doesn't mean we're right. That just means that's the tangled vine that we're using to untangle other tangled vines. And sometimes it works for us, that's all. Okay, enough of that. Here's the quote. Early one Sunday morning, she prays, and she prays and writes down her prayer in her diary. Dear God, these are anxious times. Tonight, I lay in the dark with burning eyes, as scene after scene of human suffering passes before me. I shall try to help you, God, to stop my strength ebbing away, though I cannot vouch for it in advance. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves, that in order to help ourselves, we must help you, is what she said. I want to rephrase the sentence so it's clear, that we must help you to help ourselves. And that is all we can manage these days, and also all that really matters. That we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves. Think to Takanagarbha, the inherent Buddha nature that all beings possess. That we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves. Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances, about our lives. Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. There are, it is true, some who even at this late stage are putting their vacuum cleaners and silver forks and spoons in safekeeping instead of guarding you, dear God. And there are those who want to put their bodies in safekeeping, but who are nothing more now than a shelter for 1,000 fears and bitter feelings. And they say, I shan't let them get me into their clutches. But they forget that no one is in their clutches who is in your arms. So that's the passage that I think reveals to me, when I hear it, a profound insight. Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances, about our lives. Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. I feel that that's very profound. And when I was musing on it, I tried to draw a parallel with Takanagarbha. And I haven't looked at this since I wrote it yesterday. So I don't know if I'm going to like it or not. But so the Takanagarbha, the Buddha within, that has no agency or efficacy. Buddha just is. No, the thus come one. Buddha is just what arrives. And when they talk about Buddhas, they say Buddhas don't move. Bodhisattvas who live in a non-abiding nirvana, they don't renounce samsara, but they don't get stuck there. They don't enter fully into nirvana, but they realize nirvana nonetheless, but they don't fully achieve Buddhahood because they want to stick around and help beings. Buddha just is. That's some of the conceptual doctrine. So the Buddha within that has no agency or efficacy of its own, but whose qualities spontaneously leak out through our pores when we make sincere effort to heal our karmically formed lives. So the Buddha, from the early Tathagata perspective, Buddha nature is within, but it's covered by these obscurations. You know, it doesn't, Buddha's always radiating light, you know, that much it does, you know, that's its nature. It's just to illuminate what is. But we can't see what is when we have the obscurations, you know, so we must help Buddha. You know, Buddha can't help us, you know, Buddha can't save us, but we can help Buddha. And when we help Buddha, Buddha's light spontaneously emanates, and that's a blessing. But that blessing, which is already actual, is latent without our work on our obscurations. So, more on Dogen and his unpacking the Buddha nature. So, in the fascicle Busho in Shobogenzo, which means Buddha nature, you know, Dogen deliberately misquotes a famous saying that of the Buddha, you know, attributed to the Buddha, that all beings have Buddha nature. All beings have the Tathagata Dharma. Look it up just to make sure how Dogen himself misquotes it, maybe reconstruct the actual quote from Dogen's misquote. I still have to, here it is, I think. No, that's not it. Here. Yeah. Okay. Shakyamuni Buddha said, all living beings have the Buddha nature. The Tathagata abides continually and is not subject to change, which kind of contradicts a later assertion by Dogen. So that's the original phraseology. Shakyamuni Buddha said, all living beings have the Buddha nature. The Tathagata, the Buddha, it continuously abides without change. Dogen, basically, that first part, rather than saying all living beings have Buddha nature, he said whole being is Buddha nature, or whole being Buddha nature. And so that's his famous misquoting of the passage. So in that step, he's offering a palliative to a reification of Tathagata Garbha, like there's a seed inside of us that needs to come out. And then Buddha nature will be revealed to us and bless all beings. He's saying all beings already are Buddha nature, as they are. And if that's not clear, let me quote some more Dogen to get you even more confused. Is the light all the way up? I'm not sure. Check. There we go. So Buddha, just a little bit further down in the Buddha nature fascicle, you show Dogen says the following: Buddha nature is no other than all are, because all are is Buddha nature. All are is not 100 broken pieces. All are is not a single tall tail of iron. As it is a held up fist, it is not limited to large or small. When it is called Buddha nature, It cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with all sages. It cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with Buddha nature. I'm going to read that again. Go a little bit further down this rabbit hole with Dogen. Because, pardon me, Buddha nature is no other than all are. Because all are is Buddha nature. All are is not 100 broken pieces. All are is not a single rail of iron. As in a held up fist, and Tanahashi, I think, has in brackets, something dynamic, is not limited to large or small. When it is called Buddha nature, it cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with all sages. It cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with Buddha nature. Call Buddha nature is the make a mistake. Is what that last statement implies. Okay, so share with you how Stephen Hine tries to unpack that thorny passage. The rhetorical sleight of hand expressed at the beginning of Buddha nature classical epitomizes Dogen's hermeneutic method by reading. Is that the passage? Oh, here. I can't find it. I don't want to take more time looking for it. But from what I can recall, the thing that I remember that he said, okay, so let's go over this quote again. I'll try to come back a little bit. Buddha nature is no other than all are. So Buddha nature is no other than what Suzuki Roshi calls one whole being. Buddha nature is nothing other than the whole universe arising on this moment. So he's using some rhetoric to kind of like drive that home. Buddha nature is nothing but all are. That's Buddha nature. No, all are, flashing into being right now, all are. That's, I think, what he's saying. Buddha nature, yeah, because all are is Buddha nature. Then, so what does that mean? So there's this issue of unity versus diversity. Like the poem Sandokai, the unity of oneness in many. And so all are is not 100 broken pieces. All are is not, you count every little thing to the nth degree, and you sum up all the minute bits and pieces, and then you've got Buddha nature. That's not it. All are is not a single rail of iron. So it's not one big ball called the universe either. So it's not one, it's not two, it's not one either, that famous Zen saying. This is a poetic way that Dogen is trying to say, true nature is not two, and it's not one either. All are is not 100 broken pieces. What's arising right now is not merely a discrete phenomena, chair, light, dying flowers, watch. That's not all are. All are is one big ball called the cosmos either. As it is a held up fist, it is not limited to large or small. It's the dynamism coming into being right now. It's the dynamic energy of oneness arraying itself as many. In that dynamism, they are one. And that the dynamism of that one has the myriad things and one whole being. It's like the Sandokai says, they shake hands. You know, they're together. They're in the dance called All Are. So that's two sentences in Dogen, which is all about the oneness, the unity of difference and sameness. There's another way of translating Sandokai. So that's a little bit about Tathagata Garba, deep, abstruse topic. And that is the answer to birth and death, the reality of one whole being. If we penetrate birth and death, we arrive at home in the reality of true nature, in the nature of how it manifests, how it arises. If we're willing to pay the price, if we're willing to do the work. And I want, and what is the work? That's the last thing I want to touch upon. Well, one image for the work is the Tathagata Garba, the embryo or womb of the Buddha. It has the covering of obscurations. And in the Untitled Chapter, they talk about a jewel covered in a rag, a seed covered by its husk. And so one way of illustrating the work is to relinquish the obscurations, to not cling to emotional disturbances. They're going to occur, but not to cling to grasp at them as real, as who we are. We are angry, we are despondent, but we see the impermanent nature of all being and let go. And then the other obscuration in the Uttara Tantra is the cognitive obscurations. Mistaking the label of things for their actual nature. That the word chair really describes the fullness of the reality of that which is before us. So that's good. And if we do that work thoroughgoingly, we will drop self. We will drop body and mind, because self is nothing but a ideational structure, a conceptual structure that we've created, oftentimes based upon how we're feeling. I suck. I'm really great. They suck. They're my friend. They're my enemy. That that's what the self is that arising concept. And it's nothing but. So the work ultimately is to drop clean to a self. The image that's often used for the self in Uttara Tantra is a mirage. Like a mirage, in contemporary life, you're driving down the highway and it looks like there's water on the road. The atmospheric conditions are such, there's the appearance of what looks like water. But we know it's not water. The knowledge of the truth of what we're seeing doesn't cause the mirage to cease to arise. It will still arise, but with knowledge, we won't rush towards it to quench our thirst. We won't slam on our brakes to keep from falling into the lake. People say, oh, that's the highway in the atmosphere doing a thing that looks like water. Doing the work of letting go of the self you won't get to a place where you'll no longer experience the arising of a sense of self. Just like when certain physical conditions are present, the mirage arises. When certain psychophysical events happen, our sense of self will arise, and we may grasp at it, or we may remember to practice intimately and return to the moment and see its impermanence. If we see the impermanence of the mirage of the self, we see Buddha nature. That's part of the work. That's essentially the work. So Dogen says to study Buddha Dharma, the Buddha way, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. To forget the self is to be actualized by all are, by the being that comes in, which is not two and not one. But the trick is the dropping of the self. The Japanese word that's used to describe a Zen monk or a Buddhist monk, I think it's in all Japanese traditions, I'm not sure, is unsui. Unsui means clouds and water. Clouds and water. And so a Zen monk is supposed to be free and unattached, like clouds flowing in the sky, or water flowing in the valley. So that image has a certain romance to it. It might sound really groovy. I'm dating myself. It might sound really cool, but there's work involved. So here's a description from Mountains and Water Sutra, another fascicle of Dogen, which I think expresses the freedom of the Buddha way, the realization of unsui, clouds and water. And it's the way the fascicle begins. Dogen says, mountains and waters right now actualize the ancient Buddha way. That first sentence, mountains, waters right now actualize the ancient Buddha way. Each abiding in its phenomenal expression. Phenomenal expression, which is, phenomenal expression is what's arising now. That's the phenomenal expression. Each abiding in its phenomenal expression arising now unfolds its full potential, its reality. So that's the first two sentences. Mountains and waters right now actualize, make real, manifest. I think Tanahashi's earlier translation is mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. But in the later edition of Showa that came out, he changed it to mountains and waters right now actualize the ancient Buddha way. Basically the same thing, but are the actualization of is less dynamic than actualize. So I think that stresses the right nowness of the ancient Buddha way. Each abiding in its phenomenal expression, each arising right now, unfolds its full potential, its full reality, its full truth. Now, what does this have to do with unsui, clouds and water? Since mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, Since mountains and waters have been active since before the beginning of time, is what that reference means. They've been active since before the beginning of time. What does that mean? The present, where Buddha nature all are occurs, is outside of linear time, outside of depressive time. Linear time, depressive time, referencing past and future to come to the present, is all conceptual. Hence, it's all an obscuration, according to Tathagata Dharma theory. It's not real time, it's imagined time. So, since mountains and waters have been active since before the beginning of time, they are alive this moment. that's quintessential Dogen. He brings a lot of basic Buddhist teachings into a very simple, quizzical sentence. But if you're careful with the sentence, you see they're making a very deep a point that has deep roots in basic Buddhist thought. He's deeply rooted in fundamental Buddhist thought, and then he brings it to a unique life. Since mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive. They are alive this moment. Since they are the self, since before the arising of form, they are emancipation realization. They are freedom itself. Okay, so these are more sentences in a different way, trying to unpack the nature of true nature, the nature of Buddha nature. The actual being time of this moment is outside of linear time. Since mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive this moment. So the Tathagata Dharma theory, where you cultivate leveling of obscurations to release Buddha nature, is inside of time. So there's something limiting about it. It limits the actual reality of what Dogen sees as Buddha nature. All are. What's arising right now. Okay. And likewise, since they are the self, since before the arising of form, another reference of outside of time, the arising of the material universe, they are emancipation realization. They don't promote it, they don't transmit it, they are it. Buddha nature, whole being Buddha nature, it is. It's harder to come up with anything more precise than that. Now here's the Unsui part. Because mountains are high and broad, the way of riding them out, because mountains are high and broad, the way of riding the clouds extends from the mountains. The wondrous power of soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. So, mountains are high and broad, they extend the way of riding the clouds. The wondrous power of soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. So he's using, mountains and waters, it's Buddha nature. The ancient Buddha way is the way of soaring freely in the wind, riding clouds. So profound freedom. Buddha nature, the practice realization of Buddha nature, which is an activity, not an attainment, but the practice realization of Buddha nature is a profound freedom. But there's work to be done. And this is the last bit for tonight. That it's already almost 8 o'clock. Ancient masters Yang Shan and Gui Shan said to each other, what is the wondrous clear mind? No, what is the wondrous clear mind? What is true nature? What is Buddha nature? Same question. What is the wondrous clear mind? What is true nature? What is Buddha nature? I say it is mountains, rivers, and the great earth. So all are is Buddha nature. It is mountains, rivers, and great earth. It is the sun, the moon, and the stars. So that's the Unsui, the freedom of the clear mind, which is mountains, rivers, and the great earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And Dogen goes on to say, thus we know that the mind is mountains, rivers, and the earth. Mind is the sun, the moon, and the stars. What is said here is not more, not less. Mountains, rivers, and the earth mind are just mountains, rivers, and the earth. There are no extra waves and sprays in this mind. The sun, moon, and stars mind is just the sun, moon, and stars. There is no extra fog or mist. So to actually realize the freedom of Unsui, of what Dogen is talking about with the ancient Buddha way, is the mountains and waters right now is the ancient Buddha way. To live that, we have to study the great matter of birth and death. We have to incorporate the true nature of our embodiment into our living. We have to de-repress the ungraspable nature of our life. We have to de-repress the fact that there's no abiding self, that our stories, our narratives about who we think we are, our narratives about who we think other people are, they're not going to let us ride the clouds. Clinging to our self-preferences, our self-identity, clinging to that illusion, running towards the mirage like it's a source of living water, will prevent us from flying in the wind. So there's work to be done, and the work is perpetual. Dogen's realization was that practice and realization were one thing. You don't practice in order to attain something in the future. Practice itself is the realization of the way. Because just because we know what a mirage is doesn't mean we stop seeing. Just because we have had some experience of insight into the emptiness of the self doesn't mean that a sense of self will stop arising. It will arise, and if we fall asleep, we'll reify it. We'll be trapped by it. So we're constantly studying the self. We constantly have to study how the self arises and see if we get sticky anywhere. And then if we can, we see more deeply, we see that nothing at all has unchanging self. That insight will give us some capacity to let go. There's an expression in Zen, parting the weeds to discern the way. The weeds are always there. And if we don't make the effort to part them, we just see the weeds. They're just in our face. So perpetually practicing, and that practice is realization itself. We part the weeds to see the way, which is the obscurations, the afflicted mental states, emotions, afflicted emotions, and the conceptual coverings over the ineffable, incomprehensible nature, actual nature of phenomena. We think we know what they are, and that's where we go wrong. So we're parting those weeds to actually see all are, to actually see the wondrous, ungraspable, always liberated nature of the present moment. Present moment is always already liberated. But we're just sometimes elsewhere. So we practice intimately, return to where we are, and see the nature of what's arising. Study it deeply. Buddha cannot help us. Buddha just is. Buddha just all are. But we can help Buddha by getting out of his way.